Hello there and welcome to a brief promotion of a new children's book which I have written. Now, whether or not this particular video is child appropriate, it doesn't matter, as this story, The Four Friends' Birthday, is scheduled for release on the 23rd of May 2025, which by the time this video is out, or by the time you're watching it, is probably already out, but hey ho. But be sure to get yourself a copy if you're a fan of slice of life content or even media from the 90s or early 2000s. This story is aimed for young audiences, so do keep that in mind. You can pre-order now on Amazon, link provided down below in the description, or you can wait for the story to be in stores or online on other marketplaces. You can even choose between a paperback or Kindle edition. Regardless, I shan't waste any more of your time. This is a brief promotion, so be sure to buy yourself a copy today. Now, onto the video. Hello there and welcome to the very final Kenny vs. Spenny series review, and we're on series 6, the one that a lot of people really don't like. So, is series 6 really as bad as a lot of people say it is, or is it actually quite good? Well, hopefully I can decide that myself, because this is a series review and I'm going through every single episode of series 6, including the Christmas special at the end. So without further ado, here is Kenny vs. Spenny series 6 review. So the first competition is who is the bigger idiot, or who is the biggest retard, as it was initially named. This episode was actually cut from the series initially, and the reason why was because of it being offensive. You know, this is a show that prides itself on being really offensive. And of course, you know, this particular episode, given the circumstances, given the things that happen in it, you know, it's no wonder. It is no wonder that it is, of course, you know, cut, because Kenny acts like a proper retard. Spenny, you know, he's just listing a load of dumb things that he's done, and it's yeah, it is one of those things where it's like, you could kind of tell that it's just, it was going to get cut no matter what. Which is kind of funny because, of course, the show does dive into a lot of really, you know, offensive stuff. You know, the weed episode, for example, is just one of them. And, you know, it's funny that this one episode is the one that got cut. This was one that was too offensive, too, you know, grotesque for the censors. And, well, I mean, given how Kenny acts in this episode, yeah. And, of course, you know, Spenny wins this because, let's be honest, he is a big idiot. I mean, how can you not give Spenny the win here? It is sort of humiliating for Spenny in that sense. As an episode goes, the problem with this episode, in my opinion, is it's way too gag heavy. Like, it's one of those episodes where it relies way too much on the filler gags, the over-the-top sort of scripted jokes, rather than actual, you know, competition stuff. And, you know, it's not to say that it's not funny or anything. It's just, I'd rather see a more of a competitive side to these episodes. You know, it's why I like episodes like Sleep or Beer or something like that, you know, where there is competitiveness in it. Even if Kenny cheats, it's still fun. With episodes like this, on the other hand, it's like, the verdict is at the end, and everyone knows that Spenny is a big fucking idiot no matter what. So, of course, the verdict is already predictable, because we kind of already know that Spenny is going to win this, because he's the bigger idiot. But, like, at the same time, I personally do not think that this episode is necessarily the most entertaining, in the sense that it is very competitive. You know, they don't really interact with each other, Kenny or Spenny, much in this episode. They only really interact near towards the end, and that's about it. You know, or when Spenny sees Kenny, you know, acting the way he does, you know, at the very least, you know, that bit is funny, and I do quite like that. But it's very few and far between, as it's really filled with a lot more scripted humor rather than actual, you know, competitive, you know, stuff. Should it have been cut? Now, personally, I don't think anything should be cut, no matter how offensive it is. I'm really against censorship. And so, you know, I don't think it probably should have been cut, especially given the episode that they decided to give a two-parter to, which is a really boring shit episode, spoiler alert. You know, it's yeah, like this one's an okay-ish episode, all things considered, you know. And you're going to hear me say that a lot with Series 6, like, for the more better episodes, is that it is okay. It's not spectacular. There are a few that are really spectacular, and I'll get down to that. But the problem with Series 6 is they knew that this series was ending, and in some ways they tried to go all in, but in other ways they kind of just sort of said, you know what, fuck it, let's just relax a bit. And I feel like that kind of hinders this series a lot, is that they kind of go a bit too laissez-faire rather than actually doing stuff. But hey-ho, this is an okay episode, all things considered. Up next is Who Can 69 the Longest? Now, this one is, in my opinion, it's very similar to the handcuff episode, or the, you know, who can use their hands the first, etc. Basically, they're tied together, and they're tied together in a 69 position. I love this episode. This episode is hilarious, and I think I had this on my honorable mentions for the best episodes list, because I just think this is such a fun episode. Now, what happens is Kenny and Spenny, they're tied to each other essentially in this sort of BDSM gear, and they're in a 69 position, and it's just hilarity because they have to try and function while in that position. The production crew gets a little bit bored of them basically squabbling on the floor, not really getting anywhere, with Kenny sometimes farting in Spenny's face, and, you know, wanting to get coffee, and, you know, trying to avoid each other's genitalia, etc. And so the production get involved, and that's when they start just torturing the two. They push them down hills, they, you know, squirt them with like a hose, they do all this horrible stuff to them, and it's brilliant. It is hilarious shit from beginning to end. Now, I know some people don't really like the fact that this episode is kind of a slow burner, like in the sense that the first half of the episode is them two just struggling and squabbling on the floor, while the second half is the crew just fucking around with them. And, you know, I can understand why people don't really like it in that respect, because, of course, you know, you watch these episodes, you want Kenny and Spenny to do stuff while in this position. You want to see how they struggle, how they cope, and how long it takes before one of them snaps, breaks, you know. We saw this with the handcuff episode, for example, which is infamous, where, you know, Spenny snaps. He snaps, he has enough, he can't stand wolffish. You know, it's one of those things where it's like, you know, you understand why a man gets to a point where he just wants to murder the other man. And this one could have been more interesting in that respect. You know, we could have tried to see them, you know, who knows, maybe use the toilet, or maybe go to bed in that position, you know, shit that would have been really awkward in that sort of position, and wondering how they're going to go about it. Obviously, it is limiting because, of course, you essentially have a pair of legs at the bottom, pair of legs at the top, but also heads and everything else getting in between. It would be quite limiting to try and do those sort of ideas, but see them crawl, maybe, I don't know, that might have been quite interesting. I still love this episode. This is still a fun episode. This is still a really funny episode. I can understand the aspect that, yeah, the first half could have been, you know, maybe edited better, or maybe, you know, they could have done a lot more while in that position. We could have seen how they struggled, rather it just be this long drawn out, them struggling on the floor, essentially, with the second half just them being bullied by the production crew. And don't get me wrong, the production crew fucking around with them is great, and I love the fact that Kenny wins basically legitimately this time, because, you know, of how volatile the production crew is. I'm sorry for that cough, but, like, it is just a brilliant episode, brilliant idea. Maybe they could have done a lot more with it. Maybe it could have been, you know, given a lot more time and a lot more filming. I don't know, but still, I think this is a fantastic episode. Alright, so up next is Who Can Squeeze More Boobs, and if you know my opinion on Kiss More Girls, or which was the other one, Sleep With More Women episodes, you know that I find these ones to be very cringy in an aspect of it just feeling very egotistical rather than actual, you know, interesting competitions, and also the fact that 99% of the time, Spenny and Kenny are always apart from each other, and it's some of the best content is when they're together. In this case, this is another example of them being way too far apart from each other, and you get a very dull competition in general. Essentially, the idea is just to squeeze boobs. I mean, that's a simple topic. And Spenny, you know, we all know Spenny is very creepy. We all know that Spenny, when he's in public, when he does things, he is very awkward, he is very creepy, it's unsettling to watch Spenny in public, what I'm trying to say. And I get that, on some, ends, on some respect, people do like that aspect. I think Kenny even says that, he loves seeing Spenny, just make a fool of himself. And, it is funny seeing Spenny make a fool of himself, but at the same time, when it comes to certain topics like this, and knowing that Spenny is a bit of a, porn addict, and he is a bit of a freak in general, it kind of makes you feel a little bit unsettled. It's a bit like having Harvey Weinstein in public doing this competition. You wouldn't feel comfortable about it. And, Spenny, the base of the whole episode is just to humiliate Spenny. You see him at his most awkward, his most creepy, and, he comes up with these ideas of, oh, why don't we go to this party and do it? And, why don't we get drunk and do it? And, it never goes according to plan. And, his ways of trying to do it, he gets, yelled at, he gets pushed away, he gets, told he's a freak, he tries to explain it's competition. Spenny just doesn't have a good time. Meanwhile, Kenny, because Kenny is more beloved than Spenny, Kenny has an easier time. He opens up a little convention for himself, really, where he signs autographs and he squeezes boobs that way. He also goes to this mannequin store and just squeezes a bunch of fake boobs, and it all counts to the competition. And so, Kenny skyrockets in points. So it's really, this is the type of episode where you already know that Kenny's won this, and you see it through the point system, where Spenny is struggling so bad, and you see him just utterly humiliate himself constantly throughout the entire episode, and you see him just be cringy and awkward. And so in this particular episode, it is just a Spenny torture porn, really. It is just Spenny being awkward and weird, and everyone points and laughs at Spenny, which, to be fair, is like 99% of the show. But in this case, it's I don't really like the competition. It's a very cringeworthy competition. And I don't really like the fact that Kenny and Spenny are apart so long in this episode. The better episodes are the ones where Kenny and Spenny are together, and you just see the shenanigans take place right there. Very rarely has it worked where they're both apart and it is still entertaining. Most of the time when they're apart and it's not as entertaining. And this is another example of that. It's just not very entertaining seeing them so far apart. It would have been more interesting to see them more together. And so, that kind of bothers me a bit. Spenny, again, it's just, I personally find it cringeworthy watching him act creepy. I just don't like it personally. That's just my personal taste, obviously. I know some people do like it. This is one of those cringeworthy episodes, in my opinion. It's, and what I mean by cringeworthy, I mean by it's an episode which I don't really like to rewatch. It's not one that I would rewatch, straight away. I'll be like, oh yeah, I definitely want to watch Squeeze More Boobs. It's definitely going to be on the lower end of Kenny versus Spenny episodes to rewatch. Not necessarily like the worst of the worst or really bad, like to the point that you don't want to watch them at all. And unfortunately, Series 6 does have a few. It is one of those, like, it's not for me. It's not something that I enjoy. It's not something that's going to, enlighten a lot of people. So, I don't really care for this episode. It's too cringy for my taste. Moving on. Who Can Keep a Chicken Coop on Their Head the Longest is a fantastic episode. I said it before that when it comes to animal-related episodes, the goat is the number one. Like, goat is number one by a long shot. But if I were to pick a number two, Chicken Coop would be that number two, because it is just such a funny episode. It's such an absurd episode as well. Like, I've mentioned before, I love the absurd ideas, the ones which are just so out of there, so obscene, so unusual, and yet you can't help but laugh about them. Dead octopus in your head is a brilliant idea. It's a stupid idea, but it's a brilliant idea. It's wild, it's wacky, it is dumb. Absolutely stupid and dumb, but it's great, and the execution is even better, especially when he gets drugged. And this is a similar idea where essentially they have this big cage around their neck, around their heads, and they have a chicken inside, and they have to cope with a chicken inside. Now, obviously, during the competition, they realize there's not really an end goal to this competition, because both of them aren't really going to take the chicken coop off their head, no matter how much, Kenny tries to mess around with Spenny, and how much Kenny tries to mess around with getting a chick instead of a big full-grown chicken, which arguably is cheating, but still, brilliant idea. And I love the comedy bits where he is pretending that this little chick, I think he called it Kilgore or something like that, I think that was the goat called Kilgore, I don't remember, but he calls the chick, this satanic demon, and then he treats it like a little slut because, it has a boyfriend and it's talking to, it's absurd little gags like that. And this is where, in my opinion, the sort of cutaway gags, dare I say, the little extra bits work, in my opinion, the filler, because the comedy is great. Ultimately, the two then decide, why don't we talk about abortion? Why don't we have a big speech and discuss abortion in front of a judge, and the judge will, base it around that. And of course, Spenny agrees because he thinks it's a great idea. And I love the execution of this abortion talk at the end. So, for those that have never seen it, obviously, spoilers alert, basically, Kenny has orchestrated this whole idea. Because there's no set end goal with the chicken coops on their heads, Kenny decides, why don't we just talk about abortion? We'll have a judge it, and I'll be, against abortion, and you can be for abortion. Of course, Spenny does all this research with the chicken attached, and I love how he gets attached to the chicken as well, even though it's shitting and causing all sorts of problems, and he's freaking out over salmonella. Meanwhile, Kenny, he doesn't really put much effort in, and of course, when we get to this abortion talk, Kenny, he makes fun of it. He jokes about abortions here and there, saying how women don't deserve rights, how Spenny, is a living abortion and all that shit. It's brilliant. And then Spenny, he's talking about things in a really professional manner. Of course, Kenny, he gets a big, hook and pulls the chicken coop off his head, ultimately resulting in Spenny losing because the chicken coop is off his head. And he reveals that the whole thing was orchestrated by him, the fake judge, the set, the stage, everything, and he fell for it. And it is such a brilliant execution, in my opinion. And I love the fact that Kenny does prank Spenny across along the way. He once again destroys his bedroom. He once again does all sorts of shit just to bother him. He gets a big eagle, which doesn't work. It's funny how it just flies back and forth. It's brilliant, absolutely brilliant. And the humiliation is also animal related. Spenny gets a skunk to try and spray him on the face, which is just, it's brutal but funny. I love this episode. It's definitely the second best animal challenge. The first is still Goat. Goat is just amazing. This one is still really amazing. This is probably the highlight of Series 6, in my opinion. When it comes to Series 6 episodes, this one may be my favourite, just because I love this episode so much. So from one of the best episodes of Series 6 to easily one of the worst in Series 6. In fact, this is probably one of the worst in general. One of the worst episodes, in fact, I believe I had it in the top 4, maybe. If I can recall my top 10 worst Kenny versus Spenny episodes, this was in the top 4. That's how bad this episode is. Or maybe it was top 5, I don't remember. It was up there. It was so high up. This is who can get further with the other guy's mum. Easily one of the worst episodes ever made. To describe it in one word, it's creepy. It is beyond creepy. Once again, we have a situation where Kenny and Spenny are just split apart from the whole episode, which doesn't really help with it doesn't really help, because when you look at Kenny versus Spenny, some of the better episodes, and I've said this already, is when they're together, when they're pranking each other, when they're fucking around with each other, when they're constantly sabotaging one another. The plans and schemes that go on ahead. This is one of those episodes where that doesn't happen. Instead, they are split apart, going for each other's mum. Or in Kenny's space, he's just dicking about in his bedroom with a pig. That's about it. Spenny, on the other hand, he's very creepy. He is beyond creepy. He's borderline rapist in this episode. And obviously, he is trying to get with Kenny's mum. And it's just not entertaining to watch. You don't laugh at this episode. You don't feel comfortable watching this episode. You just watch it and you just feel you just feel unnerved about it. It's not an episode that you want to watch. It's not an episode you want to sit through. It's not an episode you want to see with friends. It's an episode that doesn't need to exist. And it is one of those episodes where it's it is so cringeworthy. It is so creepy. It is so unsettling that it's not funny by that point. If you're not entertaining your audience and you fucked up big time, that's the way I see it. And that is what this episode is. It is not entertaining in the slightest. The concept of it could have worked. Maybe if you had both of them there, witnessing the other trying to seduce the other's mum and, just, I don't know, making jokes or making some sort of plan to sabotage each other. I don't know. Like, I just don't know how you could have made this work without it just being an absolute flop. And that is what this episode is. A massive flop of an episode. Genuinely one of the worst episodes in the show's history. Like, this is easily one of the worst episodes I have ever seen from Kenny versus Spenny. And it's episodes like this that probably give Series 6 the negative reputation that it has, because no one's going to sit down and watch this sort of episode. No one is going to enjoy it either. It is shit beyond shit. Who can win a cockfight? Now, this one does make me laugh in a weird way. Basically, they must fight with their own penises. I love the training segment for this episode where they're flicking their penis about with like a knife attached or something like that, and it's just so stupid. It's so weird. Like, this is, again, one of those episodes where it's just such an absurd idea, but it actually kind of works in a way. It's an entertaining idea. You don't feel, bored by it because it is just so dumb and so silly. It's so crazy in all the weird and wonderful aspects of it. I think what makes this episode, kind of weak, though, is that it does feel like a very short episode. I don't know how to describe it. Like, it's a bit like one of the episodes that's just popped up, like 69, where it's an interesting idea, but the episode feels weirdly short. Like, they're doing one thing for the whole episode and that's it, and there's no real, it's not like multiple things at once that feel like it's a much more big and extended sort of like adventure, so to speak, or it just feels very short. That said, I do love the fight itself. I love the fact that Kenny has all these contraptions, fireworks, shit like that, and it just flares off, attacking Spenny, and Spenny freaks the fuck out. It's brilliant stuff. Like, the fight itself is brilliant. I love that Spenny just gives up almost entirely straight away. It is one of those episodes where, it feels very short, but at the same time, it does make up for it for being entertaining. Like, especially considering how bad the previous episode was. This one is a massive step up in quality, and whilst it is on the more average good side, where it's like, okay, 7 out of 10 maybe, it's still a fun episode. It's still an episode you're going to sit down and watch. It's still an episode you're going to really enjoy, unlike the previous episode, which was absolute shit. So maybe it's a case of, well, the previous episode was so bad that this episode is much better by comparison. I don't know. For me, this is still a good episode. I enjoy it. Up next is who is the better basketball coach? This one is interesting because, of course, Kenny has gone on record to say that he absolutely hates sports-related competitions, and Spenny was definitely the one that said, let's do a sport competition, let's do badminton. That was an idea that's never happened on the show, but obviously was an idea that Spenny really wanted to do, and of course Kenny was just against it. This one is definitely a Spenny-orientated competition, but it is hilarious. This is a fan favourite to a lot of people because a lot of people love this episode, myself included. It is a good episode. Essentially, they have to be basketball coaches, and what happens here is absolute magic. So it reminds me a lot of the pro wrestler competition where, like, Spenny is trying to take this so seriously and he's trying to, be the best, the very best, while Kenny is just, he's dawdling, he's being a dick, he's just being funny here and there. And what we get is just absolute brilliance. So Kenny spies on Spenny at one point, and it's such an obvious and fake disguise that, of course, Spenny just reacts and freaks out and just, insults him and all that. So Kenny ultimately gets a team, and his team is a bunch of these wheelchair users who are playing basketball. And Spenny decides, because he's got the idea that Kenny has been spying on him, why doesn't he spy on Kenny? He does, he sees this, and he immediately gets like, oh God, I feel bad now because I've got a professional team. He's got, disabled players. He's doing this psychologically to get to me. And so Spenny has to come up with a new team so that's more fair with the basketball players who are disabled. And of course what ultimately happens is he gets a bunch of children to be on his team. Kenny gets a bunch of able-bodied men to fight alongside him. And it is brilliant. It's just this dominant display against Spenny's team, and you just see him slowly but surely, just react with just absolute anger, depression, and acceptance by the end of it, the 5 stages of grief. He really just goes through it all. And it is just perfection. Like, sport-related competitions, we only really have 2 that are really, really good. That being the pro wrestler and this one. There are some which aren't so bad, I guess. Well, no, they're not really. Figure skating, is just a whole ploy against Spenny, which I guess is kind of funny. Boxer is absolutely terrible. But you do get this one, and you do get pro wrestler. This is one of the best sport-related competitions they had. Kenny absolutely mutilates Spenny's, hopes and dreams. It is brilliant in all sense of the word. It is hilarious. It is great. It has some brilliant moments as well, like when Spenny lifts his arms and says, "What the hell's going on?" Like, he is so confused. And the trickery going on is brilliant. I absolutely love it. I love how Kenny doesn't give a shit about this competition, but he's just willing to just humiliate Spenny throughout it. And he does so with such a meticulous plan, which I absolutely love. I believe this also has one of Kenny's favourite humiliations, where he pretends to defecate on Spenny's face. I don't know why that's one of his favourites, but it is what it is. Still, very good episode. There's a reason why a lot of people love this episode, why it's a fan favourite for sure. It's a great episode. Up next is the only ever 2-parter episode in Kenny vs. Spenny history, and it's a really bad one. It is Who Do Black Guys Like More. Everyone knows about the Who Do X Like More competitions. A majority of them are shit. They are absolutely bad. They are either mediocre or they're just not got anything good about them. And it's not a case of like they're the worst of the worst necessarily. There are some which are really, really bad, like Gay Guys, which is just abysmal to a lot of people, including myself. And it's one of those type of competitions that no one finds enjoyment out of. So why the flying fuck did they think that it'd be a good idea to split this particular competition into 2? Especially as this is easily one of the most boring episodes or boring 2-parter I have ever seen from Kenny vs. Spenny. It is absolutely boring. So for those who don't know, the reason why this is a 2-parter is because who is the bigger retard, or who is the bigger idiot, however it was going to be called, I think it was retard, wasn't allowed to be aired because it was deemed way too offensive. So as a result, they split this one up into 2 parts. And holy shit, does it show why certain competitions should not be split into 2 parts, because this is such a nothing 2-parter. Like, nothing fucking happens for the most part. It is so boring. Like, oh my god, is it so boring. Like, I can barely remember some of the stuff that happened in the episode. Like, Spenny makes a fool of himself as per usual when it comes to guests. Kenny hatches a plan. We all know what the plan is, and Spenny assumes none the wiser. Spenny goes first as per usual. Kenny comes along and fucks him over. I will say this, I think the Kenny plan is quite fun. It is easily the highlight of this particular challenge, to this particular 2-parter. Basically Kenny pretends to be a black maid, doing all this cooking and washing and what have you, and Spenny is openly just insulting Kenny and like getting really upset about Kenny doing this racial caricature, etc., and he's just insulting, belittling and all that. So of course Kenny secretly records Spenny doing this. They get a real black maid, and he shows the footage off to the black people that they have for this particular challenge to vote them, the judges. And I won't lie, that is the highlight. But even then, like, the black people just, they don't really care. Like, it really is, like, they're a little bit shocked that Spenny acts this way. Obviously, Spenny doesn't know he's, insulting Kenny, not the black community. But it is just a really boring episode. Like, the judges, the black people they have, they're not the most entertaining. Mind you, old people, they weren't the most entertaining. Disabled people had something interesting. You had the one guy who was in on the whole thing secretly. And who did she like more? Like, that's probably the only one that is really good, because it's just such a brilliant scheme, and it's actually quite a good episode. But this episode is just so boring. Like, it is lifeless. And this is split into 2 parts. Like, it's no wonder the ratings dropped so significantly when you have this as one of the episodes that is now 2 episodes. And it's just, I do not like this episode. I do not like a lot of the Who Do X Like More episodes. But this one is easily the most lifeless one. You know, Who Do Gay Guys Like More is easily the worst by a long fucking shot. This one is just lifeless. There is nothing entertaining about it. This is just boring. Like, absolutely boring. There is nothing, no value in watching this. There is no value, nothing to be gained, nothing to be, entertained by. And that's really what I think about this 2-parter. It is just boring. There's no other way to describe it. Boring, 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 boring. It is terrible. Absolutely terrible. And, it's funny, when I tried watching this 2-parter initially, it was so difficult to find it because hardly anyone had it uploaded on YouTube. And, I don't think even Kenny had it uploaded to YouTube at that moment in time, when he had all the videos at one point, all the episodes I meant. So it kind of goes to show that no one really cares about this episode. Like, it is such a non-episode that no one gives a shit about it. And yet I've spent like almost 5 minutes talking about it. That's impressive. That is impressive, considering I've spoken about favourable episodes in less time. That's just, yeah. It's a shit, boring episode. What else can I say? Alright, so up next is Who Can Have More Fun. Now, Who Can Have More Fun is one of the episodes that actually has a commentary track. Although it's one of the ones with Sebi, if I recall. This one, or at least it's on YouTube. I know there's more on Patreon, but I'm a cheapskate. But anyways, Who Can Have More Fun? Basically, Kenny and Spenny have to go off and just have fun. That's it. And as soon as they don't have fun, they've lost competition. Kenny is always, he's always happy. He's always, having fun no matter what. And so Spenny is already at a massive disadvantage. And what makes Spenny's disadvantage even worse is just how he enacts and how he continues to enact his plan of having fun, because he does some weird shit. Like, for example, he decides it's a good idea to have this really boring dinner party with a bunch of like intellects who he clearly just doesn't care about, and Kenny comes along and just ruins the party. And of course, ironically, it seems to look much more lively. Spenny tries to force himself to have fun throughout this episode, whereas Kenny, nothing really phases him. Even if Spenny tries to get rid of him and takes him to another location, Kenny is still having fun. And, Kenny's fun, admittedly, does come at the expense of Spenny a lot of the time. And, in a weird way, this episode reminds me a lot of the Who Can Be Mean First, in the sense that both of them are trying to do, this one emotion, one, task, so to speak, where they can't really necessarily physically do it, but they can sort of mentally, psychologically do it, so to speak. I do think this one is slightly better than Mean, only because, well, I like Mean, don't get me wrong, I do like Mean, but it was a draw. Whereas this one, Spenny is already losing the competition multiple times. He freaks out, he gets angry and all that, so it's clear that he's basically lost from the get-go. So it's a case of how long will it take until Spenny finally snaps and admits he's not having fun. And he eventually does snap. As soon as he gets away from Kenny, he goes on this luxury boat full of women, booze and what have you, but then he just vomits, he gets too drunk, too intoxicated, and he doesn't have any fun. And so he eventually admits to Kenny that he has not had much fun. And so it is, in many ways, it isn't just a case of who can have more fun. It's how long can Spenny last before he admits he's not having fun. That's really the gist of the competition, really. Yeah. So the fun episode, I didn't really have much to say. It's an okay episode, but who can? Now, this is an interesting one. It's This was an episode which I rated, I believe, either third or second as the worst Kenny versus Spenny episode. And for a lot of people, it is one of the worst episodes ever. One of the main reasons, and this is the reason why I put in my worst episodes. God, I'm tripping over my words. Worst videos. Fuck me, I am really screwing this up. Worst episodes list. Is that this is an episode that isn't a competition. You know, you watch Kenny versus Spenny for a competition. You don't watch it for stupid gags. You know, I've mentioned it multiple times. I am not a fan of episodes where they are just gag heavy, where the whole gist of it is, you know, here is a gag, you know, for the whole episode, and there's not really any competition involved. Those sort of episodes suck, in my opinion. They, honest to God, suck. And it's not to say, you know, Kenny or Spenny aren't funny. I mean, Kenny is certainly funny. Spenny, not so much, although at Spenny's expense, it is quite funny. Who Can represented that to its most extreme, because the whole episode is not a competition. You know, Spenny wants to do a badminton competition. Kenny, you know, I've already said before, you know, he hates sport competitions. He doesn't want to do it. So he decides to pretend to be this Roman emperor. And Spenny, you know, he's struggling to come up with what the hell we're going to do, because we're meant to be doing this competition, but we're not doing it because Who Can is getting in the way. And so, you know, it's like that. Now, I really hated this episode for a long time. However, this is a good example of an episode which, in my opinion, has changed in perspective. And I think a lot of people have gone through this change as well, because Kenny has gone on record multiple times. He loves this episode. He absolutely adores this episode. And he is quite heartbroken that fans hate it. You know, and he, as he puts it, fans just didn't understand it. And really, it wasn't until I watched the commentary with Sebi that my opinion on it kind of shifted slightly. And when I rewatched it, I kind of thought, you know, it's not that bad. You know, is it top 10 worst episodes worthy? No, not really. Not anymore. You know, is it a weaker episode? Yeah, it's still a weaker episode because it isn't a competition. You know, I don't like it when competitions aren't competition, so to speak. And so this episode as a whole, as a episode which is, you know, shifted in my opinion. I don't know. This episode is weird because it isn't a competition, but it does have some great moments. Like, I do like it when Spenny is chained up and he's forced to basically defecate in like the corner somewhere. It's disgusting, but it's funny. You know, it's an episode which has some highlights, and I think once you watch the commentary for this episode and you see what the thought process and everything was, it does make it slightly funnier. It does make it funnier that, you know, Spenny genuinely, you know, wanted to do this badminton competition. It just got thrown in his face. And of course, the whole thing would be, you know, all it had to be was Spenny just admits defeat and he lost. And of course, he does lose because he admits defeat. And Kenny just wins by doing nothing, basically. And it is kind of ingenious in that sense. And I won't lie, some of the gags are funny. But, you know, I think this is an episode that is not going to be for everyone. Like, I said it before, this was originally on my worst list. This was originally, like, either second or third. And when you look at other fans and look at other people who've rated this episode, it tends to be, like, on the worst lists. You know, a lot of people consider it the worst. Some people consider it one of the worst. It's always mixed, so to speak. It's never really you know, known like what people think, but it is never really in the positive area. Like, I think Kenny was like the only person that really liked it, and you know, when you listen to how kind of heartbroken he is that people didn't like it and people hated it, you know, calling it the worst, you know, it does kind of show that, you know, he does try to entertain us. He does try to give us content that we might like, and of course it doesn't always work out, and this is a good example of something that did not work out at all in the general perspective. But I do think rewatching it isn't as bad as I used to think it is. You know, is it a good episode? It's debatable. Is it a bad episode? Not really, not anymore. It's definitely something that my perspective of it has changed. It's changed significantly, and overall, I think it's changed for the better because I actually don't hate it anymore. I think it's an okay episode. Not the best, definitely on the lower end, but it's an okay episode. I think there are some highlights. Like I said, there are some highlights here and there. It is an episode that's difficult to talk about because it's not a competition. You don't really have any major moments, and it is just gag heavy, or filler heavy. It is one of those episodes, but it's at the same time it's one of the better ones. So it's one of those episodes where, I used to really fucking hate it, but now I don't really hate it that much. Alright then, next up is who can produce the best commercial. This one reminds me a lot of the viral video episode where both of them are going out of their way to create some sort of content. In this case, it's a commercial. Kenny, he does his usual stuff. He has his own brand of humor, his own brand of, doing commercials. And even though they're a little bit too rude for TV, so to speak, and all that, Spenny, he tries to do studies on, how people do commercials, and he tries to, figure out, okay, this is the best solution, this is the best way to do it, and he, this is the episode that is quite infamous of having, Spenzo the clown or something like that, where he dresses up like a clown introducing this new cereal. This episode, I don't know, a lot of people do like this one, mainly because of the Spenny dressing up as a clown and looking like a complete retard. In that aspect, that is kind of funny, but I don't know. This episode, once again, it's one of those situations where you have both of them split apart from each other. This is how many episodes in Series 6 that we've had both Kenny and Spenny just apart from each other, which results in not a lot of content with the two just interacting or doing fun, silly activities, etc. Instead, it just feels like, I don't know, it just feels like it's just not really as entertaining. It's not getting its full potential, so to speak. And that kind of sucks in a way, because I think when they're together, it's so much more fun. Obviously, in this sort of competition, it makes sense because they are going off to film separate things. I guess that is part of the call, so to speak. But again, I don't know. I feel like the viral video episode did a better job. This just feels like a weaker version of that one. And I've said before, I'm not really a fan of episodes where Spenny wins. And that's not because I dislike Spenny. I think Spenny is a terrible person. There are some episodes where he wins, but they're actually quite good. I quite like the Haunted House episode, for example. I think that's a fun episode. But in this case, he wins, and I don't know. It just isn't very interesting, in my opinion. It's just whenever he wins, it's never that interesting. And this one, there is a slight bit of interest in the sense that he does stage the document. He does stage the reviews for his commercial, acting as if, the kids really liked it and enjoyed it instead of thinking it was absolute shit. I do like the fact that he does go ahead and cheat, and he does have that sort of existential crisis in a way. He's actually just gone as low as Kenny. That I do quite enjoy. But that's right towards the end. And I don't know, this is an episode which I'm kind of mixed on. I know a lot of people like this episode. I can understand why. It is an entertaining episode in its own right. It is an episode which you can sit down and watch whenever. I don't know, I just have mixed feelings on it. Kenny's side of the story in this, because the way I look at it is, with these sort of episodes where two both split apart and they're doing their own separate thing, is that Kenny, Kenny has his own story, Spenny has his own story. Spenny's story is more interesting here, whereas usually it's Kenny that's the more interesting one, because he's far more entertaining, far more likable, I guess, and less cringy, that's for sure. Whereas Spenny is actually the interesting one here, and Kenny is kind of boring. Kenny is weirdly boring in this episode, which is kind of an odd thing to say because he's usually the more entertaining one, but here he's not as entertaining. I don't know. This episode, I guess I can understand why people like it. I am a little bit on the fence a bit. It is watchable. It's not a terrible episode by any stretch of the imagination. it is okay, in my opinion. Like, I've said it quite a lot, it's the same with the fun episode. It's okay. It is okay for what it's worth. It's just not the best thing in the world. Alright, so up next is who can put on the best play. This episode, when I first watched Kenny vs. Spenny, I was going through all the playlists of each season. I could have sworn we've seen before, and yes, we sort of have. Who is the better actor, which I believe is series 1 or 2. I don't really remember which one it was from. But this is basically a remake of that. Basically, they have to put on a play this time and act it out, and, it has to have a decent script and what have you. Spenny, we already know, is not the best actor in the world. I mean, you can just look at Single White Spenny, for example, and you already know that he's a shit actor. But if you were to watch Spenny, do anything in a show previously, like pretend to act, like even in the previous episode commercial, he sucks at it. He is bad at it. So, again, it's kind of a foregone conclusion. Kenny, we already know, is an entertainer. He knows how to entertain. He knows how to do things funny. He knows how to do things well. We've seen it plenty of times throughout the show's history. So, once again, it's a foregone conclusion. Kenny, despite it being overly offensive, his plays, it's at least, motivated. At least has a lot of funny humor. At least it's, doing something. Whereas Spenny is boring. He does so much monologuing and he is so drab and dull. And as a result, this episode is not bad. I will say this. I actually do quite like this episode in a way. Is it the best episode in the world? Not really. There is some problems here and there. I think one of the biggest problems is so we've already seen it before. And it's a foregone conclusion. Again, this is not something new. And, Series 6 by this point should be giving us more fresh ideas. And instead we're just kind of reverting back to something before. Spenny's, play, it's just something we've seen a million times before. Meanwhile, Kenny, he does his own thing and he is more creative. Again, look at the porn episode. Kenny is more creative than Spenny. Spenny is such a average Joe, I guess you could say, such a normie, that everything he does is the exact fucking same as everyone else. He's not talented. Let's just be blunt about it. So again, it's a foregone conclusion from the start, and plus we've seen better actor. We've seen, other episodes, in fact, where Kenny and Spenny have to act out something. Kenny is a million times better. Like, that's just the truth. So, this episode I do like, but it is one of the most predictable episodes in the world. Well, we're finally on the final episode of the series. Well, okay, it's not the last episode in this review, technically, but it is the last episode of Series 6 by a technical scale. This is Who Can Stay on the Island the Longest. Now, this one has an interesting behind-the-scenes fact about it. So for those who don't know, Kenny knew the show was getting cancelled. He knew that it was not going to be renewed for another series. There's a lot of, confusion as to what happened exactly that caused it to be cancelled, that caused it to not have a Series 6. There's a lot of blame put on Spenny, there's some blame put on Kenny, there's some blame put on production. It's all over the place where the blame really lies. However, Island is an episode which was made sort of as a middle finger to the TV executives by having Kenny basically use their budget to pay for a holiday. That is literally it. This is basically a holiday for them, and they're using the TV company's budget for it just as a big middle finger, a big fuck you. And so basically the idea is they go to, I believe, Cuba in this episode, and while in Cuba they're meant to stay on an island, uninhabited supposedly, and see how long they survive. Now, obviously, Kenny has already bought this luxury hotel. He's already bought, all this stuff, and so they're just going to stay on an island. Spenny, being the guy who likes to take things way too seriously, he decides he's actually going to stay on an uninhabited island, and then of course he realizes he can't really do that, so he decides to stay in a tent outside of the hotel, which he can't really do either. And so Kenny is just telling Spenny, relax, just relax, he even confesses on camera saying, they're the suckers who are paying for this holiday, you should just relax. And in a way, Kenny is right. They are on an island. They're not leaving the island. They're staying on the island to have this holiday, do this competition as well. And Spenny, it's a case of just trying to get Spenny to slowly realize just relax. And so Spenny begins to relax, and when he soon relaxes, they go to the beach, and of course Spenny runs into the sea, out and away from land, which of course ultimately means that Spenny has lost the competition because he is not on the island. He has left the island by virtue of going into the sea, which is quite a funny way of ending it. Now, there was actually meant to be a different humiliation in this one. I believe in this episode, the humiliation is Spenny just gets his hair braided in that sort of like a black person. Jeez, that's racist. I don't mean to be racist there. The braiding of the hair. Jesus Christ, that's embarrassing. Anyways, let's just ignore that and let's just continue with this episode. Now, I know some people don't really like this episode, and I think people don't like it because it is the whole last episode thing where people, there's often like a stigma attached to last episodes because it's like, well, the last episode has to be this absolutely 100% perfect, episode like Saw Gone from Better Call Saul, it has to be like that. It can't just have any flaws, and of course the reality is most last episodes are somewhat flawed. They aren't the best. They aren't, gonna be big and extravagant, and especially if it's a show that gets cancelled and it's like, well, what else can you do? And in this case, it's a case of the best they could do was this competition. Really, it was just a big middle finger to the TV executives, and also to celebrate Kenny versus Spenny. And in a way, as a finale, there is something something that I quite like about it is throughout the series, Spenny is on edge. Throughout the show, Spenny is on edge. He can't relax. He's always, paranoid about what Kenny's going to do. Kenny is always relaxed. He always knows what to do. He always knows what's best. And he's always like 10 steps ahead of Spenny. And in this episode, you have that moment where Spenny has that epiphany and he is like, wow, I've just been wasting myself and being paranoid and scared. Why don't I just relax for once? And it's sort of like, it's poetic in a way. It's like they understood it was the finale. He understood it was the finale. And I mean, to be fair, they all did behind the scenes. But, but yeah, like I actually quite like this episode. I don't think it's bad. I think some people are a little bit too negative towards this episode. A lot of people see it as really one of the worst episodes ever. It's it's not a great finale, etc. But I quite like it. I think, there is some good nuances to it. Is it perfect? No. It's not something that I'd put in like my top 10 favorites. Not something that would be in my top 15 or 20 favorites. It's somewhere in the middle somewhere. But it's not bad. It's not bad. I think you should check it out. So after all this time, Series 6 has technically come to an end. Now, I could have talked about the suitcase rant, which I believe was from the basketball coach episode, which is a fantastic deleted scene. I think everyone calls it the best deleted scene. There was even a commentary for it because it's that good. But I will not talk about that. I won't also talk about Pandemic because that one is not really a proper Kenny versus Spenny style episode. It is just the two meeting with each other again during the coronavirus pandemic. So, it's one of those things where I just don't think it's worth talking about. However, what is worth talking about is technically the final ever Kenny versus Spenny episode, which is the Christmas special. Who can climb who can stay up a Christmas tree the longest? That is technically the title of the Christmas special, but really it is just a gag-filled episode. Now, I have gone on in the past about how much I dislike the gag-filled episodes where it is not really a competition and it's just there to make gags. One of the reasons why Who Can is so strongly disliked, or was so strongly disliked back in the day, was because it was one of those episodes. And I feel like the Christmas special was one of those episodes that sort of suffered a similar fate, where people did not like it because it wasn't a competition per se, it was just a gag-filled episode. And, I can see from that perspective, yeah, it is. It's not, it's not the most impressive episode in the world. And even as a Christmas special, it is kind of lame. But at the same time, if you look at the competition in this particular episode, who can stay up a tree the longest? It's not the most exciting competition in the world. Like, it has the two in a tree and, it's not interesting at all. And there's a reason why, you have zombies, why you have, the Christmas Carol and other, like, silly things added in because at the end of the day, the competition idea here is kind of lame. I get it's a Christmas themed competition. Maybe there could have been a better idea, like who can throw the better Christmas pie, or who can put them. I don't know. Like, so I'm just coming up with something off the top of my head. It is one of those episodes where I just do not really like the actual competition, because it is kind of lame. And I think they understood that, which is why you have all the gags filled in. Now, as for the gags themselves, there are some, I won't lie, this is actually one of the better gag-filled episodes, in the sense that the gags are actually kind of funny and are actually interesting and fun, in their own right. I love the little puppet show where Spenny is trying to teach kids to be, kind and all that, and the kids are just horrible. I love how you have this moment where, Spenny is pretending to be Santa Claus, and he's, making all these jokes about, sexy women and all that, and then you have this masked guy with a gun who murders Santa Claus. But perhaps the best part of this episode really is the Christmas Carol. Now, A Christmas Carol is already one of the greatest Christmas stories ever. No matter, most adaptations are really fucking good in their own right. Whether it's the Muppets, whether it's Jim Carrey, whether it's even Patrick Stewart for that matter, or whether it's one of the classic originals from the 50s or 80s, you're always going to have a great Christmas Carol for the most part. I mean, there are some that are kind of shit, like there was a musical one which was awful. But anyways, Christmas Carol is really the main gist of this particular episode. And so Spenny, again, he's trying to take it seriously, and I don't know why he even bothers sometimes. He's pretending to be Ebenezer Scrooge. He sees the three ghosts of Christmas past, present, and future. And what I love is that all the ghosts are based on Kenny characters. So you got the obese Kenny character. I forgot the guy's name. Is it Irving or something like that? I don't remember. The one on the mobility scooter. I love that you have him. You have the gaydar guy, the really gay fitness guy. And I'm trying to remember what the other one was. That's annoying. I remember those two in particular. I love how, it just butchers the story, but also, takes the piss out of like what has happened in the past, or stuff that we have learned from the past. So, you have the past where, supposedly Spenny, either assaulted or kissed Kenny in Amsterdam, the Amsterdam incident, which is such a mythical thing in the Kenny versus Spenny universe. You have that. You have Spenny, not really embracing his homosexuality, and it is basically just it's all a ploy to just call Spenny gay. And I love the fact that Spenny gets more and more angry as each ghost comes in, as more set pieces come out and all that. It's a brutal display of insults that is just coming his way. I love it. So, I genuinely found that to be, hilarious. I'm not going to lie. I actually found a gag-filled episode kind of funny, whereas the competition side is not very funny, or not very good in that matter. Basically, the competition ends with Kenny, Kenny and Spenny, they make an agreement. Kenny decides to step down because during this Christmas special, they sort of come up with like what they consider the actual meaning of losing or winning. And to Kenny, winning is seeing Spenny be humiliated. He doesn't care about the rules, who cares? Spenny is full on, I'm going to do this competition. I'm not going to give up no matter what. You can do all this to me. I will try my best to stay, afoot. And so, it becomes that sort of like debate almost of like what makes a competition for this show, which is kind of a neat touch considering this is technically the last episode of the show. And I love the fact that, Kenny decides to give up because he thinks that he's going to win by Spenny being humiliated, which is, of course, the ass, kiss the ass thing, which, it is humiliating for both of them in their own separate ways. But to Kenny, that's humiliating Spenny. To Spenny, he's won the competition, technically. So it's kind of like a neat little ending in a way. I know a lot of people don't really like the Christmas special. I know it's often seen as one of the worst episodes. I've never seen it as one of the worst episodes. I do think it's one of the weakest episodes, certainly. But for me, there's a difference between weak and bad. Like, bad for me is bigger balls, or gay guys, or, get with each other's mum, or what's the other one? The wait on genitalia. Those are terrible fucking episodes. Whereas this is weak. It's not dreadful. It's not, something you don't want to watch or rewatch. It's something you can rewatch, something you can watch, but it's just not, it's not got the good flavors compared to the other episodes of the show. So, as a Christmas special, it's okay. It's not the greatest in the world. I do think some of the gags actually work here. This is one of the rare times that the gags actually work for the episode. Whereas the competition doesn't really work, and I think they understood that. Still, a decent episode, decent special, and it's a decent send-off in a weird way, especially that ending. It's weird in that sense. And that is the Series 6 review as a whole. So, is Series 6 the worst Kenny versus Spenny series? A lot of people don't like this series. A lot of people would rank this as the worst series by a long shot. A lot of people dislike Series 6. It is the series which tends to get a lot of negative reviews. A lot of people don't like it because, for the most part, it is the final season, but as a final season, it's kind of a lame duck. And I kind of agree. A majority of these episodes aren't the best. They're not the most stellar. You'd think if Kenny and the production team, you'd think if they knew that the show was going to get cancelled and was not going to go on, they would do something more wild and extravagant, something that would be more, over the top. And instead we get really lame competitions. It's kind of a shame, really, especially with some of the competition ideas that Kenny has spoken about in the past. It's hypothetical Series 7, which he's talked about a few times in some commentaries and live streams and all that. Series 6, I do think is lame. I do think it is a lot of weak episodes. There are some standout ones which are fantastic. 69 is funny. The chicken coop one is fantastic, as is the basketball coach one, which is hilarious. Those 3 episodes are really the big standouts, in my opinion. Who Can is very infamous, but I do have I have softened up a bit towards that one. Unlike, say, a lot of people, or unlike some other people, Kenny does seem to have, a soft spot for this series. He has said he actually quite likes Series 6, although he does say that Series 4 is the best one, which, Series 4 is the best. That one is, there's no doubt in anyone's mind. Series 4 really was the best. Series 6, it is a weak series. Overall, the series just doesn't have enough oomph to it. A lot of the challenges, a lot of the episodes, a lot of the, competitions are just not the best, to say the very least. Squeeze More Boob is just the same as the Kiss More Women. Play is just like the drama one. It feels like we're retreading old ground, but we're doing it on a much weaker scale. And that's not to say there aren't good ones. Like I said, 69 is hilarious. Chicken Coop is fantastic, as is Basketball Coach. Now, is it the worst series of the show? Because I have already said that Series 2 might be the worst, because when you look at Series 2, you got the first 2 episodes, Beer and Naked, which are fantastic episodes, and then you just get just a bunch of shit for the rest of the show, and it really sucks, because you do get the odd highlights like Bible, but it's not very good overall, the series. I actually do think Series 2 is still the weakest. Like, if we were to look at all the seasons of Kenny versus Spenny, Series 2 for me is still the weakest. Mainly because, like I said, the first 2 episodes are fantastic, and then everything else is just really bad. Like, what the fuck happened? Like, we're meant to be better than Series 1, yet we're just nosediving in quality with some of the worst episodes imaginable. And, Series 3 had a little bit of a rocky start, with the exception of Octopus, but still, it picked itself up towards the second half. Series 4, fantastic. Series 5 is a very good watch overall. And Series 1, it's the first series syndrome. It's a little bit weak, but it's, kind of, it's trying its best to gear up to what's to come, and there are a lot of great episodes like Baby, like Stay Awake, fantastic episodes like that. Series 6 is definitely one of the weaker ones. Like, it is definitely, for me, it's the second weakest. Series 2 is the weakest by a long shot, because whilst the first 2 episodes are fantastic, the rest of the series is just shockingly bad. Like, the competitions are just not good at all. Or they're very average. Whereas Series 6, a lot of it is average. There's only like a few which are really, really bad, but for the most part, it's average. And so, I don't think Series 6 is the worst by, that sense. I can see why a lot of people don't like Series 6. I can understand, because Series 6 is weaker. A lot of the competition are kind of lame. A lot of it is kind of slower, and some of it feels like we're retreading stuff. And I think that's the problem with Series 6. It's also the fact that it was the final season. And so when you have this very weak final season, people are going to judge it a lot more harshly, because, if it was Series 6 and then Series 7 was the last, I'm sure Series 6 would have been seen a lot more favourably. That's the way I would see it. But because it was the last, and because it was so average for the most part, it's not the best. And that's a real shame. So Series 6, for me, is definitely one of the weakest Kenny vs. Spenny seasons, and it is the last one to talk about. Overall, Series 4 is the best. Series 2, for me, is the worst, just because when you look at the general picture, whilst it was, arguably an upgrade from Series 1, because, you had Beer, which is fantastic, and Naked, which is also fantastic, every other episode sucked. Series 3, 5, really good seasons. They do have a little bit of trouble here and there. Like, Series 3 starts off a little bit rocky, aside from Octopus. And Series 5 is mostly good. Series 6 is on the weaker end, though. It's very, very mediocre for the most part. And there are some really bad episodes. But, yeah. So, Series 6, if you enjoy it, you enjoy it. It is definitely the one that fans do not like, and I understand why. So, that's my general thoughts on Series 6. And I hope you enjoyed the Kenny vs. Spenny series reviews, because now we are done with Kenny vs. Spenny. Completely done. Which is a real shame. Maybe I might do something else in the future, but who knows. Until then, I'll see you next time.